So you're walking to work, new shoes, nice outfit, the kind of morning that makes you feel put together enough to believe that the world is basically stable, and then you notice a child in a shallow pond, splashing. It takes you a second to realise they're not playing, they're drowning, and there's no one else around, just you and a very ordinary, very solvable disaster. Would you save them? I'm betting you leap in and ruin the shoes. You save the child. Of course you do. The question isn't even close. And congratulations, by the way, you've just agreed with Peter Singer, and that yes has drafted you into an agreement that we've all been quietly trying to get out of ever since. Because here's what Singer noticed. You had nice shoes, you had a nice outfit, you had enough surplus resources to care about looking put together on a Tuesday morning. And when the child was drowning, none of that mattered. You didn't hesitate because you're a good person. You just acted. You knew in your bones that a child's life is obviously worth more than your comfort. But if that's true at the pond, Singer wants to know why it stops being true when you get home. Why the moral clarity disappears the moment the child is out of sight. Why the surplus you'd sacrifice in an instant for a drowning stranger becomes untouchable the moment that stranger is far away. And how much should you be expected to sacrifice to save another life? Everything you don't need, or just some of it? And what about those billionaires who have more than thousands of people need? What should they be expected to sacrifice? Everything? Because a Middle Eastern rabble-rouser once said that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And his advice to squillionaires was pretty much similar to Singer's: give it all away. But does that apply to us non-squillionaires too? It doesn't seem fair. But then, to the starving family with nothing, we all look like squillionaires. So let's dive in and look at Peter Singer's The Life You Can Save, a book that bashed billionaires, haunts consciousness, and practically broke the field of ethics. It has an answer for whether you can be rich and still be good, but we're going to ask, does that answer work? So let's talk about Peter Singer's argument in his landmark book on ethics, The Life You Can Save, because I used it to look at the recent show Pluribus in another of our videos, and while that was interesting, the focus there was really on the show. So here I want to focus on the book, because it's fascinating, even if you completely disagree with it. It is really worth reading and engaging with anyway. And I also want to add a note here about the word rich, because it means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it's a term that is fundamentally relative. So when I say rich in this video, what I mean is that anyone with discretionary surplus, that's Singer's definition too. Anyone who, after rent and food and paying for the basics of living, still has money that goes towards things like convenience, upgrades, small luxuries, that quiet accumulation of comfort. If you're genuinely choosing between groceries and electricity or similar, Singer isn't talking about you. In fact, he's saying, and I am too, that you are the people we have an absolute obligation to help. Instead, he's talking about the rest of us, who complain about prices, sure, but can still afford to go on a nice overseas holiday. The ones who can prevent serious harm at comparatively small cost, and who, let's be honest, often continue not to. Like a YouTuber that presents all of his videos in a velvet jacket. So here's what this video is actually about. It's about Singer's rescue principle, save the drowning child, the one that feels obvious at the pond. But the real fight is about its limits. First, it's about demandingness. How much is morality actually allowed to ask of you? Secondly, it's about integrity, whether a good life includes projects and commitments that aren't reducible to maximize welfare. Thirdly, it's about fairness, whether the conscientious are obligated to compensate for the selfish. And finally, it's about whether the whole frame is wrong, whether the problem is actually about charity at all, or if it's about the broken, corrupt system that keeps producing the need for charity. By the end of this video, it's my hope that you'll be able to say in plain language where your line is and why it belongs there. Because let me be very clear, and as I've argued at the end of our Pluribus video, no one should be able to coerce you or shame you or tell you what to do. Ultimately, it's your choice and your conscience. Hopefully this video gives you a few questions, arguments and counter-arguments to decide for yourself where that line is. Because philosophers and ethicists themselves, they're still disagreeing over this stuff too. There are no easy answers, but here there might be some right ones for you. So here's where we're going. First, I'll lay out Singer's argument, both the demanding version and the livable version, because people keep confusing the two. Then we'll talk about the commitment ladder, how far up you can climb before you say, whoa, that's too much. And then we'll test 6 escape hatches, 6 objections that philosophers have raised to Singer, and I'll give each one its strongest case before we see if it actually lets us off the hook. Then we'll look at what I'm calling the defenders, people who are persuaded by Singer and who just bite the bullet. And finally, we'll talk about 3 exit ramps that might actually help you make up your mind, or at least argue with strangers over the internet about it. So let's start with Singer. Now, Peter Singer is an Australian philosopher. Go the Bruces! And in 1972, he published a short paper called Famine, Affluence and Morality. It's about 10 pages long and philosophers have been trying to wriggle out of it ever since. The argument is disarmingly simple. It goes something like this. If you can prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, you ought to do it. That's it. That's the whole conclusion of the argument. The drowning child example that I cited up front is just what ethicists call an intuition pump. You see the child, you save the child, you accept that your shoes don't matter as much as a human life. Singer's move is to say, okay, now be consistent. Because here's the thing he's trying to point at. Distance doesn't change the moral status of the harm. A child dying of malaria in Mozambique is just as dead as a child drowning in front of you. The fact that you can't see them, that you don't know their name, or that there's somewhere your imagination can't quite reach, none of that changes what's happening to them. And none of it changes what you could do about it. So the pond is just a training exercise, whereas the real test is pretty much everything else that comes after it. And here's the modern twist that Singer couldn't fully have anticipated in 1972. Your phone now delivers pond moments constantly. You know there's a crisis somewhere. You've seen the posts, the headlines, the donation links. You cannot claim ignorance. The distance has collapsed, not physically, but informationally. You know. You've always known. And maybe like me, you're still often walking straight past. Now, I want to be careful here. The point isn't that your coffee is evil. The point is that the world has made trivial luxuries sit next to avoidable deaths. And most of us, most of the time, choose the coffee. What Singer wants to know is, what's your justification for that? But here's where people get a little confused, and I think it's worth slowing down to appreciate the distinction between the two arguments he's making. There are actually 2 versions of Singer floating around in these debates, and if you don't separate them, the whole conversation, as I've said before, turns into a shouting match between saints on the one hand and cynics on the other, which is really not the point of the whole thing. The first version is what I'll call the principle, the logical argument. This is the maximally demanding version. It says, keep giving until giving any more would mean sacrificing something of comparable moral importance to the harm you're preventing, which is usually another's death. In other words, give until it genuinely costs you. Not costs you like miss a holiday, but costs you like your own health, your relationships, your house, your ability to function, until you have nothing left to give. That's the logical argument. This version is brutal. If you take it seriously, which almost nobody does, it implies that almost everything that you spend on yourself is morally questionable. Every streaming subscription, every nice meal, every new pair of shoes while children die of preventable diseases. That's the version that most people attack. And honestly, it is infinitely attackable. It's extreme. And if someone were to truly adhere to it, we'd consider them a saint or mentally ill, or possibly both. But there's a second version, what I'll call the program, the empirical argument. This is Singer in pragmatic mode. He knows that if you tell people give until it ruins you, most people will give nothing at all, and that it basically isn't humanly possible. Anyway, humans don't work that way. So he spent a lot of time arguing for something more realistic. Give meaningfully. give consistently, make it normal, make it sustainable. He suggests targets, 5% of your income for ordinary earners and much, much more for the wealthy. He talks about building a culture of giving in our societies, not a monastery of saints. So why does this distinction matter? Well, it's because half the objections people raise to Singer's arguments are objections to the nightmare version, the sell everything and live on rice version, while Singer is often arguing the version you could actually live with. And that's not a bait and switch. It's more recognizing that humans need paths that they can actually walk. So keep both versions in your head, because we'll need them in a minute. One more thing before we move on. Singer's argument has teeth because in some domains, the numbers are surprisingly concrete. Organisations like GiveWell have spent years trying to estimate the cost of saving a life through targeted interventions, through malaria nets or deworming programs or direct cash transfers or nutrient supplements. The estimates vary and they're subject to a lot of things, but we're talking thousands of dollars, not millions. GiveWell's top charities, and I'll put a link in the description below, spend between $3,000 to $5,000 per life saved, which is incredibly efficient. Now that might sound like a lot, but keep in mind that it costs tens of thousands of dollars in the developed world to even train a guide dog, for example, or to save a life here, and that even the US government puts the value of a life there at $10 million. GiveWell also applies the highest standards of accountability and transparency to ensure that the money is actually going where it says it is and that it's actually working. It is focused on, sorry to use a crude phrase, but bang for buck, or spending precious resources as efficiently as possible to save as many lives as possible. And it tracks and warns about issues like corruption, waste, and fraud. The point is that when we are discussing discretionary surplus and Singer and his critics, we're not talking about sell your house money. We're talking about skip a few nice dinners money, and that you're not the only one contributing, that those few $1,000s to save a life come from a lot of people. Now, I'm not saying that those numbers are gospel. I'm not saying that every charity is effective or that giving money always helps. We'll get to those objections. But the point is that the "it's too complicated to help" excuse has gotten a lot harder to maintain. There are effective interventions. They work. You can find them. And that sharpens the question Singer keeps asking. If it's this cheap to save a life, why aren't we doing it? That's where the commitment ladder and the escape hatches come in. Because here's the simplest way to see what Singer has done to you there. He's turned a one-off emergency into a structure. The pond isn't just a scenario, it's a ladder. And if you were honest a moment ago, you already know that there's a rung where your confidence starts to wobble. So let's climb that ladder. So here's rung 1. You see a child drowning and you save them. That's not even really being good. That's just not being the kind of person who watches a preventable tragedy and keeps walking. The cost is nothing really beyond getting wet. So think about rung 2. Same child, but saving them ruins your shoes. The nice ones, the ones you saved up for, the ones that make you feel like you had your life together this morning. Still easy. You might grieve those shoes a little, but you don't treat your wardrobe as comparable to a human life. You step in. Then there's rung 3. Same child, but saving them means missing an important meeting and cancelling a weekend trip you've been looking forward to for months. Now we're not talking about a single moment of inconvenience. We're talking about a real sacrifice in the currency people actually defend. Things like time, pleasure, plans, money. You still probably say, yes, I believe in you, you're good people, but you can feel your mind already starting to search for an exit, right? And then there's rung 4, same child, but saving them means a significant ongoing change to your lifestyle. Not a one-off rescue, a pattern, a permanent reduction in optional comforts. Less of the buffer that makes life feel smooth. Now we're negotiating. Now we're rationalizing. Now the yes starts coming with conditions, right? Okay, so now we're climbing to rung 5. Same principle, but now there are thousands of children, and not one pond, but an endless series of them. And the cost of saving them over time starts to look less like ruin your shoes and more like restructure your life. Give up the holiday, downgrade the flat, rethink what enough means. And here's where Singer's argument gets uncomfortable, because he's saying you're already on this ladder. You've been on it since you first learned that money could save lives. The only question is which rung you stopped at, and whether your reason for stopping is a principle or just a preference that you've promoted to a principle. Now, the point of the ladder is not to shame you. It's to locate your line. Because most of us want two things that don't easily fit together. We want to keep the moral clarity of the pond, the part where we're the obvious hero because we obviously do the right thing. And we also want to keep our lifestyles mostly intact, with our comforts feeling morally neutral. The latter is what forces those two desires into direct contact. Singer isn't asking you whether you can be perfect. He's asking you whether you can justify where you stop. And if you can't justify it, then I stopped isn't a moral conclusion. It's just a description of where our willpower ran out. So here's the question, and I mean it as a serious diagnostic question for you, not a throwaway engagement trick. Although if you want to comment and like, hype and subscribe, I'll take it. Where do you stop on the ladder? Was it at the weekend or the lifestyle? Was it earlier? And what's your justification? Not feeling, not your vibe, not because I'm tired, but your actual moral and ethical reason. That's what we're trying to work out here. Because once you name that reason, you can test it. And that's what we're going to do next. 6 escape hatches philosophers have built to get out of Singer's grip. I'm going to give each one its strongest case, and then we'll ask the question that actually matters. Does it limit Singer, or does it excuse doing nothing? Okay, 6 objections against Peter Singer's arguments in The Life You Can Save. And I'm calling them escape hatches because that's what they feel like when you first find them. They feel like relief or air, a way to keep the moral inside of the pond while keeping your life mostly intact. And some of these hatches are real. I'm not trying to dismiss them, but some of them are, I'll be honest, just well-dressed evasions. The point is to be able to tell the difference between the two and use them to help you drawing that line. So, escape hatch number 1. Demandingness. The demandingness objection starts from a simple human fact. Morality cannot ask for everything without turning life into a permanent emergency room. If you could always do more good, then you can never stop. You can't clock out. You can't rest without guilt. You can't enjoy anything without hearing an invisible drowning behind the music. And here's the deeper problem. If Singer's principle swallows everything, it starts devouring the very reasons we care about human flourishing in the first place. The philosopher Susan Wolf puts pressure on this with what she calls the moral saint problem. This is a life consumed entirely by moral maximization, and it doesn't look like a fully human life at all. It crowds out art, friendship, play, weird hobbies, long walks, the kind of joy that doesn't need to justify itself. A good life contains more than being useful. If morality eats the whole thing, then you've built an engine that destroys its own fuel. Although actually that's most engines. Maybe I mean the source of its own fuel. Anyway, you get the point. You can feel this tension in the comments on our Pluribus video, for example. Someone says something like, Singer is impossible for normal people, and someone else replies, well, I live in a van. If I count all the change I can find, I might be able to eat something, but I would happily give that up to save someone's life right now. Both reactions are pointing at something very real. People vary widely in capacity and sacrifice tolerance. Morality that pretends otherwise becomes cruel or unenforceable, or both. Demandingness, I think, is a real limit. It pushes back on the maximal reading of Singer's principle, but it doesn't create permission to do nothing. It's like the existence of a ceiling doesn't erase the floor. So for me, in this objection, the hard question isn't, do limits exist? The hard question is, where is the non-zero minimum that can be asked of someone with discretionary surplus without demanding a life of constant self-sacrifice and self-erasure? So let's count that one as a partial escape. You can have a life. We want everybody to have a good life, but you can't buy moral amnesty. So number 2, integrity. This escape hatch has teeth because it attacks a deeper assumption. It isn't only saying that Singer asks too much, it's saying that Singer's style of moral reasoning risks treating you like a relay station for utility. because you have projects, you have commitments, you have relationships, you have things that you care about that aren't justified by their contribution to global welfare. They're justified because they're yours. You're writing a novel, you're raising a child, you're building something that matters to you. You have duties to people who depend on you and to your community. People hear Singer and immediately worry about becoming someone hollowed out by the obligations he proposes. The kind of person who can't justify anything and will love nothing, provided the spreadsheet approves. Here, the philosopher Bernard Williams argues that a moral theory can actually violate integrity when it demands that you abandon projects and commitments that are constitutive of who you are. Things like your relationship, your work, your craft, your promises. They're not decorations, but the very scaffolding of your life with you as their author. Williams is pushing back against the idea that you should step outside your own life as if you're merely an instrument for producing good outcomes for other people. There, you are being used as a means and not being treated as an end in yourself, which is ironically the opposite of most forms of morality. So think about a person who spent years becoming an artist, and not a commercially successful artist, but someone who makes weird, beautiful things that don't sell. Singer's principle, taken strictly, would say, well, that time could save lives. That money could save lives. Your art is a luxury that the world can't afford, and you should be doing something else. And something in us recoils from that, not because we don't care about drowning children, but because a world where no one is allowed to make anything beautiful unless it's efficient and effective feels like a world that's lost the plot. Williams, I think, is right that some projects are identity constitutive. A life includes commitments that deserve protection even when they're not the maximum possible good that you could do. But here's where I want to push back a bit. Because most of what we might call ground projects or things that fundamentally constitute who we are might actually just be preferences that we've upgraded into thinking they're necessities. We may love a show and buy all the merch, but that's not who we are. Our sports team is not who we are. They win or they lose without us. We don't become moral philosophers just because we have a complicated lifestyle where we pay to participate in a bunch of things. There's a narrow, legitimate use of this objection. Protect what's genuinely constitutive. And there's a cheap, illegitimate use. Relabel comfort as identity, then call it ethics and accuse everybody else. So, does this objection work? Yes, but the escape room is pretty narrow. It means that we should protect what's genuinely constitutive of ourselves, but not confuse that with identity. Now escape hatch number 3, and it's a biggie. Fair share. This one stings, and I think we have a lot of strong, possibly justified feelings about it. It has a strong philosophical version and an even stronger psychological one. The strongest philosophical version goes something like this. In an uncaring world, demanding more from the caring is unfair and it's potentially counterproductive. If others refuse to do their part, the conscientious shouldn't be punished for having a conscience. Then comes the bit I think we understand almost intuitively. Billionaires exist. Tax havens exists. Corruption exists. Our government has the capacity to do way more than charity ever could. So why is the moral spotlight on my $12 lunch? Liam Murphy makes this point in his work Moral Demands in Non-Ideal Theory. Obligations can shift when widespread compliance fails, he argues, because otherwise morality becomes a tax on decency. The fair share view says you owe your share of solving the problem. You don't owe everybody else's share too. Now, I think we should feel justifiably angry about this and take the objection seriously, because it is an undeniable part of our shared reality. The distribution of moral burden is, in the current state of the world, genuinely unjust. You're not wrong to look at a rigged system and feel that the moral pressure has been outsourced downwards. You're not wrong to notice that the discourse around ethical consumption, for example, tends to land on the individuals while the corporations skate by. The people with the most power, it seems, to change things are often the people doing the least. So let's do some quick arithmetic. The wealth of the world's billionaires could, by most estimates, end extreme poverty multiple times over. Their marginal dollar matters far less than yours. They wouldn't even notice it missing. Progressive obligations like this aren't some radical idea. It really is basic maths, in the same way that progressive taxation is basic maths, unless your moral philosophy begins and ends at mine. So the anger is legitimate. But here's the problem. The argument someone richer should do it has never been a moral argument. It's a description of unfairness, yes, but it's not a permission slip to do nothing. If a child is drowning and a stronger swimmer is standing by, your obligation doesn't vanish. It does change shape. It becomes partially about saving the child and partially about dragging the stronger swimmer back into reality so they feel compelled to do it too. Murphy's point can cap what's fairly demanded of you in a world of non-compliance, but it cannot turn the suffering of others into something that we ignore until the wealthy start behaving. Instead, Singer argues that your obligation is proportional to your capacity, which seems inherently fair, and it's not eliminated by someone else's failure. And here's the kicker. The fair share view also implies that we owe it to pressure upwards too. If the billionaires aren't paying, part of our job is to make them. That is not optional. That is morality, and they're not excused from it. So if your moral theory always lands on, some billionaire should do it, you don't have a moral theory. You have villain fanfic. Yes, the unfairness is real, but the alibi isn't. In the eyes of ethics, we owe our share, plus the obligation to put pressure on those who won't pay theirs. But let's turn to escape hatch number 4, systemic critique, one of my favourites. This is often the smartest objection in the room, if I do say so myself, but it's also the easiest to weaponise as an excuse because, trust me, I've done that too. The strongest arguments go something like this. Charity can actually legitimate injustice. It lets the system off the hook while individuals feel virtuous. It turns structural harms into private lifestyle choices. Worse, it can become a moral laundering operation where the powerful keep the machine running while the comfortable buy a sense of goodness through a subscription. The real duty on this view isn't donations. It's reform. It's to stop treating poverty as a natural disaster and start treating it as a policy choice. Here enters Thomas Pogge, who I had lunch with once. He's a really nice guy and really fascinating. He's a philosopher who anchors this critique through the idea of institutional harm. The affluent don't merely fail to help the global poor, according to his argument. They participate in the global arrangements that sustain deprivation and exploitation. These are things like trade rules, debt structures, resource extraction, tax systems that enable evasion, a dozen different things. In this view, poverty looks less like bad luck and more like the very predictable output of a broken or corrupt system. Under that framing, the issue isn't merely positive duties to help. Instead, negative duties not to harm come into play as well. And charities might be unintentionally playing a role here too. One of the comments on my Pluribus video put it really well and pretty bluntly. It said something like, "This conversation is very American. Most charity is just a front for laundering money. If you want to help, try to sabotage the system that allows it." I can't deny that there is something to that. Although I am absolutely not advocating that you should run out and join a domestic terror group. Please don't do that. That's not ethical either. What I mean is that there might be something like the saviour industrial complex, and it might be real. We see this in the way that charity can sometimes become a performance of goodness while the unjust structures that create the demand for that charity stay intact. And here's the uncomfortable part of that, at least for me. Charity can become, to steal a phrase, a private carbon offset for the soul. You donate, you feel clean, and you go back to participating in the same system that produces the need for that donation in the first place. But here's where I want to be precise, because this is where the objection can slide into being a bit of an alibi, and an undeserved one at that. Institutional injustice can increase your reform or activism, or call it what you will, duties and obligations, but it does not erase your rescue obligations. If the system is guilty, the child still drowns. If the system is guilty, the need for reform becomes urgent, yes, but the need for rescue still remains. Because a world with structural injustice contains two problems at once. One is immediate. People are dying today. The other is persistent. The machine keeps producing ponds. For me, that means we kind of have to do two things at once. We have to rescue now because people are dying of preventable causes while we are having this conversation. Some of that death can be stopped with the resources we have. But we must also push for reform always. We need to fight the machine that keeps producing the need for that rescue, and don't let charity become a substitute for justice. Neither track excuses us from the other. We don't get to skip rescue because we're focused on reform. And we don't get to skip reform because we've donated. Honestly, I do think that this is the strongest critique of Singer's framing. This might be being a bit unfair, but at least in this book, he kind of accepts the world the way it is. But his critique isn't an escape hatch like the others. Indeed, it adds more duties on us than just the need to donate. And then there's escape hatch number 5. Aid skepticism. This is the one that sounds worldly and often just hides laziness. It goes like this. Charities are corrupt, aid backfires, dependency, overhead, distortion. The giver gets status while the recipient gets harmed. How do I know my 20 simoleons isn't making things worse or being wasted? Now, the strongest versions of these arguments make some important points. Aid can go wrong. Interventions can create perverse incentives. Some organisations exist mainly to consume donor money while producing a glossy report and a photograph. Singer's response is simple and brutal. Uncertainty doesn't let us off the hook, and it particularly doesn't let us off the hook when there are organisations like GiveWell to investigate and report on exactly these issues. I Might Do Harm is a reason to do our homework, not a reason to opt out of giving entirely. As I've said, evidence-based giving exists, transparent evaluation exists, cost-effectiveness estimates exist, direct cash transfer research exists, and it shows that it is highly effective. It also, incidentally, shows that a universal basic income is highly effective, so you might want to tuck that one away in your back pocket for future arguments. You don't need to become an economist, but you also don't get to hide behind that vague distrust, as if that were a moral position. Just do your own research, or better yet, look at the many reports that have done it for you. And when someone says, what if saving causes harm? The answer is, then you choose methods with strong evidence. You avoid obvious traps. You learn and you revise. That's what we do in every other domain, from researching which is the best home theatre system to what we eat every day. So this escape hatch, I'm sorry to say, is a research problem, not an ethics excuse. We must evaluate, not abdicate. Lastly, we've got escape hatch number 6, consent and coercion. Now, this one matters because it touches the fear beneath a lot of resistance, that our obligation might become a trap. It's something like, always ask before you enforce your belief on others. And it asks, when does a duty become compulsion? If helping is mandatory, who gets to force it? If you've seen my Pluribus video, you know where this road can lead. Pluribus is the nightmare version of this conversation. It's perfect moral compliance achieved by force or by fusion. A world where no one can refuse to do good because no one can refuse anything. The rescue principle wins, but the self disappears. That's the extreme version. But the worry is real even at lower stakes. Moral demands can sometimes be very preachy and seem to shade into coercion. You should give can become will make you give and will publicly shame you if you don't. And that's a very different kind of world. So here's a distinction I want to draw, and I think it's important. Moral obligation is not the same as political or social permission to coerce. Singer's argument is about what you owe. It's not about what can be extracted from you by force. The case for giving is made through persuasion. It's made through norms, through social expectation, and through voluntary institutions, through evidence. It's not a case for the state to empty your bank account. And some obligations should be socially expected. Some should be collectively enforced through just institutions like progressive taxation. But many, I'd argue, should remain in the realm of conscience. Now, these are inherently political questions, but they don't make the moral claim disappear either. We can believe that people ought to give, strongly, seriously, and as a genuine moral demand, without believing that anyone has the right to force them. Ultimately, I think this limits the enforcement of our duties, of what we owe to others, but not its moral seriousness. We can refuse to be coerced and still be obligated. The fact that no one can make us doesn't mean we're off the hook. So, those are our 6 escape hatches. Some of them carve out real limits on demandingness, on integrity, on fairness, and on enforcement, but none of them creates permission to do nothing. And that brings us to the people who respond to all of this with a kind of grim clarity, the ones who bite the bullet and say the quiet part out loud. So far, we've been looking for, let's be honest, ways out, limits, permissions, lines you're allowed to draw. But some philosophers look at all of those escape hatches and basically say, haha, nice try. They don't deny that the argument is demanding, but they do deny that demandingness is a rebuttal, or that integrity has a veto, or that non-compliance means you don't have to either. They look at the pond, look at the world, and conclude that our discomfort is doing a lot of moral work for us. This is the bite the bullet posture. It shows up most clearly in philosophers like Peter Unger and Shelley Kagan. Unger's book, Living High and Letting Die, takes Singer's logic and pushes it further than most people want to go. He argues that the psychological distance we feel between child in front of me and child far away isn't a moral principle. It's a bias that we've dressed up as an intuition. Kagan makes a similar move. He's skeptical of the agent-centred prerogatives that philosophers use to carve out projected space for personal projects. His view is that if you can do more good, the burden of proof is on you to explain why you're not supposed to. These are not comfortable positions. They're not meant to be. The bullet biters aren't saying be a saint or you're worthless. They're saying if you're searching for a philosophical exemption because you don't like the cost, that's not philosophy. That's just searching for an escape hatch once again. And as we've seen, none of them truly let us escape. Now, I'm not going to ask you to become Peter Unger. I'm not sure that I could either. But here's the uncomfortable truth that survives almost every reasonable objection. Even if you reject the maximal version, even if you accept limits on demandingness, integrity, fair share, and all the others, Singer's argument still keeps a claim on you. Not perfection or sainthood, something non-zero, non-performative and sustained. The obligation isn't that we owe everything. The obligation, I think, is that we owe something real, something we notice, something that costs us a little bit more than a like and a sad face emoji or a changing our profile pic. That's the part we all keep trying to escape. So, what do? Well, first, let's put it all together. I've argued that Singer's principle survives, chastened but intact. We don't owe everything, but if we're well off, we owe a floor of decency that can't be bargained down to zero with clever talk. The escape hatches give us limits, but not exits. Demandingness means we get to have a life, yes. Integrity means we get to protect what's genuinely constitutive of who we are. Fair share means our obligation scales to our capacity, not to everybody else's failure. And systemic critique means we have to push for change too. But none of them gets us to zero. And if we're going to draw a line, you need a reason for it that's better than I prefer not to. Here's the framework that I keep coming back to, and I think it's two duties, not one. The first is rescue now. People are dying today. The system is not a first aid provider. We don't get to let the child drown while we write a dissertation about why the pond exists. Even if we think the world is unjust, especially if we think the world is unjust, the immediate preventable harms still matter. And the second point is reform always. Fight the machine that keeps producing ponds. Because if we stop at charity and treat it like absolution, we've built a morality that functions more like good old medieval indulgences. We donate, we feel clean, and then the machine keeps running. Neither duty lets us off the other. So here's how I'd frame the choice. Give what we can, fight for what we must, and celebrate the good that we can do in other people's lives while giving them the means to do good for themselves. And if you're interested, I would really encourage you to read Peter Singer's book. Even if you disagree with it, it's useful. It helps us know where we stand and what we value. It's the kind of self-knowledge that good philosophy and good lives are built on. So, can you be rich and good? That's the question that we started with. And I've been circling around it for a while without giving you a clean verdict. I realise that. And here's why. Because I think people want ethics to behave a little like a courtroom. They want a verdict that either acquits them or condemns them. They want the comfort of being told that they're fine and they're doing well, or the drama of being told that they're damned and they're very naughty boys. Singer is more annoying than that. He gives you a principle that keeps reappearing in different costumes and at different distances, and he forces you to decide what kind of person you're going to be when nobody's watching and there's no pond to perform heroism beside. Singer's test isn't pass-fail. It's a mirror. Because if I've done my job well, the argument doesn't go away when you close this video. Neither does the discomfort. And that discomfort isn't a design flaw in ethics. That's what moral seriousness feels like. If you never feel it, you're probably not being serious about it. And if you feel it constantly, well, then you're probably not being a bit sane. The task is moderation and to make it actionable without letting it become either theatre or paralysis. So I'm going to end with the question we started with. And this time I want you to answer it in the comments too, if you like, but really honestly and inside yourself. Can you be rich and good? Singer's answer, it isn't no. Singer's answer, only if good costs you something and you choose to do it anyway. But here's the biggest secret I can tell you from personal experience. Helping feels good. Being good feels good. Being a part of the solution, regardless of what everybody else is doing, that feels good. Some of Singer's arguments might make us feel bad, but it shouldn't. Because throughout the book, he points out just how much good we have done already and how much good we can still do. But that's it for now. So until next time, be wise and be kind and give a little thought to the life you can save.